Hello everyone and welcome to the IFST Spring Conference webinar series, The Appliance of Food Science. My name is Helen Munday. I am President of the Institute of Food Science and Technology. Throughout this series, we will be showcasing the very best in food science and, in particular, its application through the very latest in technologies. We will be celebrating the hugely positive contribution food science and technology makes in ensuring the food sector continues to deliver. These presentations were originally part of the programme for our spring conference, which has had to be cancelled due to the current COVID-19 crisis situation. We are very pleased to be able to still bring you these presentations via webinar every Wednesday throughout April into May. I would like to thank the Food and Drink Federation for kindly sponsoring this series of webinars. We would also like to thank our corporate sponsors, Marks & Spencer, Nutraceuticals Group, IFST and Camden BRI, who provide sponsorship throughout the year, which helps IFST to deliver many of its charitable activities. I hope you enjoy this webinar and would encourage you to register for other webinars in the series. With that, I hand over to Natasha Medhurst, IFST Scientific Affairs Manager.
Thank you, Helen. Our speakers today are Sterling Crew, Andy Kerridge and Chris Gilbert-Wood. Sterling is chair of IFST's Food Safety Group. Andy is the vice chair and also chair of our Midlands branch. Chris is chair of IFST's Scientific Committee. They're all key members of IFST's COVID-19 Advisory Expert Group, along with a number of other people who are working hard to provide support and guidance on food-related matters. For more information on their biographies, please look on our website. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Chris.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Natasha, for your kind introduction. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you to all of our colleagues in the food supply chain, from farm to fork, who are working so hard to ensure the continued supply of safe food under some very challenging circumstances. A number of the questions you asked last week were about that very subject. How can we continue to provide safe food currently? To answer that, let's just stop and quickly review how we produce safe food day in, day out. After all, we're always having to manage and adapt to changing circumstances. The industry does this by systematically understanding the hazards we face, be they biological, physical or chemical, identifying those that are risks and putting in place mitigations to control those risks. As I'm sure you all know, the process we use to manage food safety risks is HACCP, and by using it correctly, a food processor will ensure they have in place an effective food safety management plan. This will include the prerequisite programs and critical control points needed to produce their products safely. The prerequisites are simply the essential measures that provide the basic environmental and operating conditions for the food operation so that they can produce food that is safe and wholesome. The critical control points are the steps in the process that ensure food safety and define the way that those critical controls are managed, monitored and verified. That is the process we use. Now let's look at this emerging biological hazard. It's a virus. We do know that viruses cannot grow in food or indeed outside of their hosts. They can survive in the environment and slowly become inactive. Specifically, for this virus, the expert advice is that it is very unlikely that you can catch COVID-19 from food, and COVID-19 is a respiratory illness. It is not known to be transmitted by exposure to food or food packaging. So in answer to one of the questions unanswered from the previous webinar, yes, it is absolutely the right thing to do for the HACCP team to review your food safety plan in light of this new risk, using this expert advice, and to continue to do so as your business adapts to the emerging situation, reviewing all the changes you're making to ensure you continue to produce safe food. As we stressed on the previous webinar, this risk is new and emerging, but the food industry's routine food safety, risk management and change control procedures, when followed correctly, will protect us, our teams and our customers. As you all know, HACCP should be applied to a specific operation, product and process. However, let me point out a couple of areas that I think you should consider when managing the risks presented by SARS-CoV-2. Your people and hygiene prerequisites. For people, there are a couple of areas that I think you need to focus on. Fitness to work procedures, making sure everybody understands the symptoms of COVID-19 and when they should not come to work. This needs to be backed up by HR procedures that support individuals to do the right thing. The other areas are the disciplines we expect food handlers to follow so they protect the food they're dealing with, such as regular hand washing, the use of PPE, and good personal hygiene behaviours. Many of these are the disciplines Public Health England are using to protect us in the community, along with social distancing. And so you also need to work how best to implement social distancing within your operation. But the food handling disciplines that your teams have will also help them protect them and their families in the community. Finally, to make sure these basic disciplines are implemented, it's essential to make sure your training confirms and reconfirms the importance of these disciplines. Leadership is also vital. All your leaders, from frontline managers to the top of the business, need to lead in a way that promotes and reinforces the behaviours expected. The other area I mentioned was hygiene and the frequency of cleaning, and in particular looking at the contact surfaces within your business, those that are touched regularly by all your team members. A good idea is to grade these into high contact, medium contact and low contact. For high contact areas that are frequently touched by lots of the team, they might need to be cleaned every 15 to 30 minutes. Medium, every couple of hours, and everything else must be cleaned at the end of each and every shift. Increasing the cleaning of contact surfaces achieves two things. It minimises the risk of transmission within your workforce. Also, it deals with the challenge you face when a colleague reports in sick. We know that it's possible for people to be asymptomatic. So clean accordingly, and if or when somebody calls in sick after being in the factory, you can be confident that any contact surfaces have already been cleaned thoroughly. Another area of questions was about our understanding of the virus, and hence I assume how we can validate the assumptions we are making in our HACCP studies and controls. The virus is new and emerging risk, and so we do not know as much about it as we'd like to. However, there are respected sources of advice that can allow us to leave the complicated virology to others. The World Health Organization, EFSA, the FSA, and Food Standards Scotland have all produced guidance on the virus and its implications to the food industry. These are the sources we need to rely on at a time of emerging risks, and thankfully, all of their advice is reassuringly similar. Last week, the FSA released its risk assessment on SARS-CoV-2, and in this they highlight what is known and also not known about the virus and its behaviour, making it a useful resource for us all. The FSA has classified the risk to consumers in the UK from food as very low, very rare but cannot be excluded. However, this is also tempered with a high degree of uncertainty, as there are several gaps in our knowledge. To come to this conclusion, they have looked at two paths of transmission. Firstly, from the consumption of products from infected edible animal species, and secondly, the risk of consumption of foods that have been cross-contaminated with the virus. There are 7 key steps in these two pathways that affect the risk presented by food in the UK, and these are shown in this graphic from the FSA's report, into which we've added the FSA's probability ratings at each stage. Each step is discussed in detail in the risk assessment, and it is well worth reading all the details. However, in summary, starting at the top of the table, the first 2 steps of the animal pathway, the probability assessment for both is negligible, the lowest rating, so rare that it does not merit to be considered. However, this is based on current knowledge and thus the uncertainty is high. Looking at the second pathway, starting with box 3, the risk to consumers from food contaminated directly by infected food handlers producing commercial food both in the UK and other countries, the FSA's risk assessment is very low, very rare but cannot be excluded. Section 4 looks at cross-contamination, the risk to consumers from food products, food contact materials and food packaging in the UK, the risk is negligible to very low, assuming good food hygiene, HACCP and self-isolation policies are being followed. Once again, uncertainty is high in both cases. However, the risk assessment contains useful information about what is known and unknown about the virus that influences the risk assessment, including survival on various surfaces and disinfection that I know Sterling is going to cover later. When assessing the risks of infected food handlers and cross-contamination in the food chain, the importance of the industry maintaining effective food safety management and good manufacturing practice, especially food hygiene and fitness to work procedures, are vital. For sections 5 on processing and how it reduces the amount of virus, and sections 6 and 7 which deal with the risk of infectious agents on imported food, these risks were unassessed, as they assumed they would not reduce the overall risk, and hence the overall risk is a worst case assumption. Although not assessed, there are still some useful references and comments in the paper in these sections. It is worth noting that in some cases food processing would reduce the risk, and in no circumstances would food processing increase the risk. In summary, the risk is very low, but uncertainty high. Those are circumstances that can lead to lots of speculation, both in the scientific community and elsewhere. In the face of this speculation, we must use trusted sources of information that use sound science as the basis for their advice, such as the expert authorities listed on this slide. This will help us implement the right controls in the supply chain to ensure we continue to produce safe and wholesome food. The other thing I'd like to stress is the importance of staying up to date with this advice. We must remain agile, ready to adapt our food safety management plans as we learn more about the virus. And on that note, what a great way to hand on to Sterling, who is always agile and up to date, as you know.
Thank you, Chris. No one has called me agile for a very long time. Even at my peak as a rugby player, I was definitely more of a cart horse than a gazelle. It does not surprise me that so many questions have been asked on the persistence of coronavirus on the inanimate surfaces and its stability in different environmental conditions. Research on COVID-19 reported that the virus is still detectable on plastic and stainless steel after 3 days, but the numbers of viable viruses were particularly low. Researchers also showed that the virus can only survive on cardboard for 24 hours. A literature survey concluded that human coronaviruses can survive on surfaces such as plastic, wood and metal for 2 hours and up to 9 days. Survival is dependent upon temperature and relative humidity levels. Similar to other microorganisms, coronavirus can survive freezing. It should be remembered that researchers use carefully controlled experimental conditions to do their work. This might not reflect how the virus might perform in more robust natural conditions. Also, non-infectious viruses could still be recovered by the eluents. There is a public concern over food packaging. There is no evidence that contaminated packages which have been exposed to different environmental conditions and temperatures transmit the infection. Nevertheless, to address concerns that virus present on the skin might be able to transfer to the respiratory system, for example by touching the face, people handling packaging, including consumers, should adhere to the guidance of the public health authorities regarding good hygiene practices, including regular and effective hand washing. If people wish, they could wipe down product packaging and allow it to air dry as an extra precaution. Studies on the efficacy of biocide substances against COVID-19 on surfaces are now starting to become available. They seem to support initial indications from different sources that this virus is not especially resistant to common biocides, based upon prior data against related coronaviruses. This means that there are many options available for surface decontamination, and good hygiene can contain the spread of this terrible disease. We already have the tools to do the job. We should remember that this is a novel virus and there remains a degree of uncertainty about its transmission. We still don't even know its R value. When considering viruses, we need to bear in mind that these infective agents do not behave or respond in the same way as the foodborne pathogenic bacteria that we're more familiar with. Viruses do not consume nutrients, respire, or reproduce on food. They do not produce toxins. They replicate within a host cell. So, we are seeking to inactivate the COVID-19 virus by disrupting its genetic material, which is encapsulated in a lipid envelope matrix. This we can do, as with bacteria, by using approved cleaning agents, especially cleaning agents which have been approved and tested against Euronorm BS 1447. We have the existing tools to do the job. Personal protective equipment, PPE, and especially the wearing of face masks, has become one of the defining challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. It has become a highly contentious, hot issue, which in itself has gone viral. We have had many questions on food sector personal protective equipment. A pertinent question, as after all, we are the country's largest manufacturing sector and employ over 400,000 people. So what are the benefits and costs of wearing face masks to protect yourself and others from COVID-19 infection, both at home and at work? Personally, I go to the trusted resources. The World Health Organization currently says only 2 groups of people should wear protective masks: those who are sick and showing symptoms, and those who are caring for people suspected of having the coronavirus, like those who are working in hospitals and care homes. Face masks are not recommended for the general public because they can be contaminated by other people's coughs and sneezes when putting them on and removing them. Also, controls such as frequent hand washing and social distancing are more effective. Wearing of a face mask might offer a false sense of security, which might lead to people dropping their guard. Although they might give a false sense of security, it has to be acknowledged that they may also reduce anxiety and give people comfort in these very difficult times. As a bit of a sideways look, I know that correlation does not mean causation, but it is interesting to note that in those countries where face masks are traditionally worn, China, Singapore, and South Korea, they have reportedly dealt with the virus more effectively. If people do choose to wear a face mask, after all, we live in a liberal democracy, they must ensure they are trained in their use and are using the right mask. This could be FFP3, depending on the circumstances and the risk posed. And of course, the face mask must be disposed of correctly. The use of face masks in the food sector should only be considered as a complementary measure and not as a replacement for established preventative measures. For example, physical distancing, respiratory etiquette, meticulous hand hygiene, and avoiding touching the face, nose, eyes and mouth. There are limited numbers of face masks available, and if it becomes more common for people to wear them, this can have a big impact upon the health service who need them for occupational health grounds. They work in a very high risk area. So the advice from the government is that essential key workers in the food sector do not need to wear a face mask. But we still have to adopt a risk-based approach to avoiding the spread of viruses in our workplace. The most effective control measure is social distancing, keeping at least 2 meters apart. This can be facilitated by using different shift patterns, introducing protective barriers between people, reorganising lines. Some businesses have even introduced temperature checks of staff entering the site to see if anyone's got an elevated temperature. But of course, this will not pick up on the asymptomatic carrier. So it is wise to assume everyone is a carrier and take appropriate action. We are fortunate that our industry already is well versed in control measures and has hand washing, hygiene, sanitation and cross-contamination control in its very DNA. We have well-trained staff. Whatever mitigating steps are taken, businesses should make sure that they apply to individual circumstances and they're not some type of blanket rule. Lastly, it must be considered that those working in the food sector do have a unique set of circumstances to consider with PPE and the wearing of face masks. The wearing of face masks by food handlers could introduce an additional potential food safety risk. There is always a temptation for a food handler to touch and readjust a face mask during a long shift. They can be very uncomfortable to wear. Adjusting a face mask could bring their hands into contact with their face and especially their nose and mouth. We spend a lot of time educating staff of the dangers of this, as it can spread food poisoning pathogens which are naturally present in our nose and mouth and on our face onto food via our hands. We know it is vital that good standards of personal hygiene are maintained by food handlers to prevent food poisoning. Contaminated hands will spread bacteria around a food preparation area quickly. Harmful pathogenic bacteria spread very easily from people's hands to food, work surfaces and equipment. That is why it is essential to wash your hands after touching your face. I believe the wearing of face masks has the potential to increase this risk. And of course, if a person turns up to work wearing a face mask and expressing COVID-19 infection symptoms, they should be excluded from work immediately. I'll now hand you over to Andy Kedridge for the final two questions.
Thank you, Sterling and Chris. I am going to talk about two areas. Firstly, what does the future look like? What are the short, medium and long-term implications for food science and technology? And I'm going to seize on that word technology because I think that's where we're going to see big changes. We were all caught out by the changes in behaviour and working practices brought about as a result of the pandemic. The food industry is now either working like crazy or closed down. There are shortages of some products and there is a prospect of crops rotting in the fields and milk being poured away. From a technology point of view, this has brought out some, strains to the system. Site audits are suspended, which causes issues when trying to find alternate supplies or for maintaining certification status. Our certification systems have proven not to be nimble enough to cope with this. Remote audits appeared briefly but were not supported. Now we have certification extension for up to 6 months and a desk audit, with some alarmingly different fees being charged for these audits. One standard owner has decided not to allow extension, so what does that mean if you are certificated under that scheme? Another major change has been with staff working from home. I was asked last week how someone working from home could do the internal audits on their site. Remote working poses many challenges, of course. For example, if you are working with a paper-based quality system, how do you manage that from home? Scanning hundreds of pages a day is not sensible. So, technology, how can it help? Well, many of the solutions to the issues of working from home and remote auditing are with us now. And it is not crystal ball gazing, it's just about making a decision. What digital food safety management system do you want? What is appropriate? Once you have the system digitized, then it doesn't matter where you are in the world. I am working at the moment with a manufacturer in Arizona on their food safety plan and documents to support that. The distance doesn't matter. Remote auditing, or at least remote monitoring, is possible now. Remember Google Glass, which is now partnered with NSF as I Succeed, but there are other smart glasses now available, and these are costing less than £1,000, something like £800. And when you take into account the cost of an audit with airfares, hotel, travel time, etc., they're very cost effective. Factories could have their own for customers to access with specific queries, or for the aforementioned internal audits at a distance. Or you could courier a set to a supplier and direct them as to what you want to look at. To be honest, it doesn't even have to be smart glasses, although they're great. You can use a smartphone and either take films or do a live feed depending on reception. So I hope this pandemic will provide a kick to the food industry to make that technological jump. Some have already made it. It is not future gazing, it is now. In the medium term, what I hope we will move away from is the idea that an audit is a point in time, a once a year event over 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 days, if you're ISO, with technology already mentioned and the Internet of Things, with sensors on trucks and ovens and doors and so on, with digitized records stamped with who made that record and when. Why leave it all for a once a year event? Unannounced audits of sites are becoming the norm, so they should be audit ready 100% of the time. We have moved away in our school system from everything depending on that final exam to now many subjects being continuous assessment with a less pressured and critical exam. Why not do the same for food production site inspection? Looking longer term is always difficult, as I expect new technologies we do not know about yet to become available. I think the food industry is a slow adapter, and we should be looking at what other industries are doing, especially in the fields of remote sensing and robotics. Artificial intelligence will definitely make an impact to help sift through all the data. The second area I'll talk about is what the IFST has been doing during this crisis. Firstly, we formed a COVID-19 advisory group chaired by Chris and with representatives from different sectors of the industry. Our aim has been to provide access to the best advice available at the moment, and these webinars are part of that. The advisory group meets twice a week, virtually, of course. The IFST is an invited member on the FSA expert panel for COVID-19 and engages in weekly meetings with the FSA, Food Standards Scotland and DEFRA, obviously via phone calls. These are two-way exchanges, and we are flagging issues we are seeing and that our members are telling us about. Issues such as food service outlets repurposing as ready meal manufacturers, vegetable distribution schemes extending their range into meats and poultry and other lines, questions about when an infected person could safely return to work, and raising awareness of the availability of technical experts and consultants. We have also put together a COVID-19 knowledge hub on the IFST web pages, but open to all. This hub has links to key resources for consumers, large and small food businesses, and will, we hope, be useful to our members and others. It is being updated as and when we are aware of new information from trusted sources. Please take a look at these pages and check them frequently to make sure you have the most up-to-date information. So back now to Natasha, as I'm sure there are more questions for us. Thank you.
Thank you all for such an interesting and topical update, giving up-to-date clarity on people's burning questions in this follow-up webinar. So moving on to the Q&A session, and our experienced speakers are here to attempt to answer your questions regarding the practicalities of managing any relevant food safety risks in the food sector, particularly from a UK perspective. So we do have a question that I'd like to touch on, and given, Chris, that you mentioned about looking at farm to fork, I'd like to ask you this one. It's about transport. So the attendees said, when end-to-end food supply chain is discussed, why are poor standards in food transport easily ignored? And just to add another comment from somebody else, where they're talking about not just the vehicles as well, which would be the large containers and also the home delivery, but they're also mentioning transport equipment such as trays, pallets, roll cages, etc., and the handlers involved in that, and whether good transportation practices or GTP should be applied.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you for the question. Firstly, I'd like to apologise if there was any inference in any of the presentation that we weren't talking about the complete supply chain. So clearly, robust hygiene measures are our main defence against COVID-19, and therefore we need robust hygiene measures throughout the supply chain. And that includes the transport that moves the goods from place to place. And in my experience, there has been a huge move on these areas in the last 10 to 15 years. And some of the horrors that I remember from the early part of my career are no longer are valid. And so I think what we're saying is equally true to the food transport industry, which is capable of running with very good standards. I don't know if Sterling got anything to add?
I'd support that, Chris. I remember some of the horror stories that I used to see at the beginning of my career as well. And there have been tremendous steps to be taken. And I think what COVID-19's incident has done has just made us recheck that the supply chain is as robust and as safe as we think it is. So it is an often an overlooked area of the food supply chain.
Can I just jut in there? And there's an area of the supply chain and transport that probably wasn't included in our discussions, which is where people have added food to the things that they are distributing. So couriers, etc., who are repurposing part of their business, being quick on their feet, but maybe not aware of the additional risk posed by the products that they're carrying in terms of temperature control and so forth. So I think there's a call out for awareness in that sector too.
No, that's really good clarity about the transport is definitely part of that attention. So the second question, how could a site amend its VASP and TASP in light of this situation?
I think the main area to look at, as we've said, is HACCP. In terms of VASP and TASP, I think the bit to be aware of is if and when you have to start changing your sourcing procedures, it is very important to find a way to deal with the things which are in your VASP and your TASP. And as Andy quite said, you're going to have to be creative about this at this time, but it's still possible to do it. So how are you going to implement the controls that you would normally have? So I don't think it's so much about amending them. I think the risks, the vulnerability risks and the threats are similar. Whether the likelihood's changed, we can have a long debate about, but it is about being creative and how you continue to implement your normal controls at a time when you can't have the audits and you can't do some of the things you would normally do.
Great, okay, thank you. So on the subject of hygiene and sanitation, if Sterling, perhaps this one's for you, is there a known concentration of sanitizer that could eliminate coronavirus on contact surfaces?
Yes, there is, and as I think I mentioned earlier, you can find it in the EU number. I think it was 1447 that sets out the concentrations for different types of sanitizers that are effective against viruses. They're slightly different than for bacteria. Just to point out, though, that coronavirus is, as Chris has mentioned, a very novel virus, so we don't actually have a lot of research on the COVID-19 novel virus itself. And a lot of the work is extrapolating from similar types of coronaviruses, such as the original SARS.
I think, add to that, though, we do know it's an invalid virus. We do know that the lipid coating, if you mess about with it, you will inactivate the virus. And enveloped viruses are relatively easy to mess about, to use a very technical term. So that's why washing your hands is so important, because soap does it, and so do a number of other things which Sterling has said have passed the EN 1476 standard. And the important thing is to find a product which has passed that standard and then use it within the manufacturer's dilutions.
I think the answer is also to just follow manufacturer's instructions, isn't it, Chris?
Yeah.
Clearly set out. And guys, if I could signpost you to the Society of Food Hygiene and Technology's excellent guidance on this. It really is the definitive work to give you the guidance of where the trusted sources are, and it gives you some great technical advice on dilution rates and type of chemicals you can use as well.
Okay, that's great. It's really worth recapping on that one, I think. Thanks for answering. So this is a question about the social distancing within food operations and the mask and so on. So I think probably best to recap on this one as well. So the attendees asking where social distancing is not possible in the factory due to the particular type of process, is okay to provide masks then?
I think I've been talking to some people, and a number of people, what they're trying to do, if they can't use distancing, what they're trying to do is use hard perspex screens to try and provide an element of distance. Clearly the important thing there is to make sure that they're included in your hygiene regimes. When that's not as easy, I think a number of people are looking at full face visors, which is almost like having your own personal screen. And again, you've got to think about the hygiene measures for that and how people clean them and how frequently it breaks. And my own view is, for many of the reasons which Sterling's talked about, and those who can see me, I've had a beard. I've lots of experience of wearing a beard snood in food factories, and I've had to train and train and train myself not to touch my face when I'm wearing a covering over my mouth and nose. It's very difficult. And for the reasons that Sterling so well explained, if we're not careful, we're going to solve one potential problem with a very real problem of the food poisoning bacteria that many of us carry around in our nose. And so we have to be very careful. And so I would be very reluctant to say yes to put a mask in. I think there are other ways of tackling it. But at the end of the day, you have to deal with the situation which is in front of you, aware of all the risks.
I would agree. Having visited factories around the world and having to wear face masks in some of them is even watching, it's hard enough controlling myself, but even watching people who are supposedly wearing these all the time, they're constantly touching their mouth or moving the mask away so they can speak clearly, or it misses up your glasses, or there are issues caused which are out of proportion to the risk posed by the COVID. Over to you, Chris.
I think the other thing I'd add is we need to think about why we might want to. So a lot of the talking which is coming now is about the ability to protect others if you're suspicious that you might be infective. Let's go back to our fit to work, our basic principles. If there's a reason why a food handler thinks they might need to protect others from themselves, they shouldn't be working in the food environment. And therefore, the other important thing, and I stressed it and I'd like to stress it again, we must have policies in place that allow people to go, I think I might have this, and therefore we enable people to do the right thing and not be at work.
I'd support that as well, guys. I think the thing is, unfortunately, there's no simple answer that covers everybody. And I think every site has to do its own risk assessment. But before you go anywhere near wearing PPE, I think there are lots of other great measures that you can use. As Chris has mentioned, we've seen innovative uses of barriers. We've seen different types of face masks being adopted that aren't completely covering the face, they're shielding the face. And what I've seen is people use some really good ideas about what does this 2 meter distance really mean. They've changed shift patterns, they've realigned lines. So I think if you're creative and innovative, then I think the PPE option very much is the very, very last option that's open to you. There's so many other good steps you can take before you get anywhere near it.
Great. It's about being adaptable and just risk assessing the process, as you say. So that's really useful. Thank you. So this question is from somebody who's acknowledged that there are FSA guidance for caterers about starting home deliveries, asking if there's any other guidelines that have been specifically published for fruit and veg home deliveries.
If you go onto the IFST Knowledge Hub, we're posting guidance there, and we're also posted some of our Q&A and things that people will need to consider as they repurpose their business. So go and have a look on there, and I think you'll get some more help and advice on how to tackle that area.
And that knowledge is continually being updated. So we'll definitely take on board any questions that arise during this session and the previous webinar to make sure everything is covered. So that's a good point made. Thanks, Chris. So you mentioned about the fitness to work and the guidelines are very clear on that. Somebody's actually asked whether they are being updated or whether they should be. I've added that last bit. So I'm assuming you could take that on as well, Chris, please.
I can, but I can see that Sterling also. So go on, Sterling.
Just a comment, Chris. I'm not sure about how the guidance have been changed, and I think you talked about a risk assessment approach anyway. But it's interesting to note, I saw that the Health and Safety Executive have updated their RIDORs, the reporting of dangerous occurrences and diseases, etc. And now I know that coronavirus 19 is actually a reportable disease from a health and safety point of view, if you believe that you've caught it at work.
So in terms of updating the risk assessment guidance, I'm not sure which guidance you're referring to. The important thing that as a business, you are making that your team very aware that if they have any reason to suspect they have the virus, that they shouldn't be working.
And so it's about your fitness to work. And there are lots of other diseases that we're used to. This just becomes a new one and needs to be trained out and included into your thinking. And I can't stress enough, make it possible for people to do the right thing.
Great. Okay. So, Andy, you talked a lot about technology. Somebody's asking about how the food industry is preparing to use technology and real-time data to ensure that quality assurance is in place for future pandemics.
Well, I think one of the issues that has arisen is that large parts of the food industry weren't ready for this. And I mean, I go around many factories, and whether it be small, medium, or even some of the large ones, are still on paper-based systems. So, you know, and it's really odd when you look into some of these factories, because there'll be parts of it that do have systems. Usually the engineering will have their system for preventive maintenance monitoring and so forth. And HR usually have a system for their training plan and matrix. And yeah, probably others do, but the food safety or technical function tends to be last in the queue. And hopefully, you know, with the struggle of managing data from a distance, the issues associated with visiting sites may provide that kick, as I said in my presentation, to push people just to take that final step and get the technical and food safety function up to date and on board with what is available in terms of digitization. Anybody else got a view on that?
No, I think you're right, Andy.
Okay, so another element of social distancing is arranging operators in split teams. So the person who's asked this question is actually running their own factory, I think, and currently implementing half work from home, and the others will split from a group A, group B, and so forth. And they're asking whether that would be a good way to avoid cross-contamination.
I think dividing your resources up and creating two separate groups is a very sensible way for all businesses to tackle the issue of absenteeism at this time. And that's what I think it is. I don't think it's about contamination in the factory. I just think it's a good way to make sure that you've split your resource population.
Whether it's one, I wouldn't necessarily change one day to the next day. You might do it 1 week to the next week to try, because of the onset time for the illness, if somebody does go downhill. I've heard of people splitting teams into 3, and just having a reserve team. So yeah, you think, Sterling?
Yeah, I agree with you, Andy. That makes great sense. My daughter-in-law works as a QA manager in a factory, and I know she's doing a lot of her work from home. So to reduce the risk of exposure and to make sure that they've got more space in the factory, some jobs you can actually work from home. Not all of it, obviously, as a technical person, but if you're writing specs, etc. And I wonder, when this terrible disease has passed and we go back to, perhaps we won't go back to normality, how things will have changed about the way we work anyway. I'm sure there are a lot of lessons that will come out about how we can work more effectively, how we can work at home, and perhaps to be a bit more open to adapting, having a culture of adapting more than perhaps we had before this extraordinary time.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, for some people, working from home doesn't always work, personality-wise and whatever. But for other people, they'll be thinking how much more I get from the day, the travel time, and etc. And you know, inevitably, people will say, some of them will say that they're more productive. I mean, I'm biased on this. I've worked from home for the last 20 years or so, but yeah, I think there will be some companies, maybe not in the food sector, but in other industries, who are looking at some very expensive office space and thinking, do we really need all of this?
And Andy, I think what you said really resonates with me about audits. It's really got me thinking. In fact, I don't think audits will ever be the same again. I think that we have shown some weaknesses in the current audit system that, as you so eloquently explained, it's a 1-day, 2-day event in the year. There must be lots of other more creative ways that we can get assurance about food safety in our chain. And I'm sure this situation will generate more ideas and perhaps speed things up a lot quicker it might have taken 10 years, Andy, to get to the situations that you're describing, whereas now I think it might happen in a year or so.
Yeah, I think I'm not saying that we should abandon face-to-face meetings and site visits, because there's a lot to be gained from that. But there's also an awful lot that doesn't need to take place on site or could be done on a continuous basis.
Okay, so another element of consumer behaviour, I've got a few questions about that, so I'll try and link those. And one was from a rural part of India, where they're asking about whether there's specific advice for that area, but more on the demand of organic food, whether that's likely to change. I guess that's just going to be a prediction rather than known information. And the other is whether you think, panelists, that the behaviour of consumers in terms of dining in restaurants is likely to change at all. I guess that would just be your personal opinion.
Well, I mean, when a restaurant's going to be open again, I think it was said that pubs and so forth were going to be quite a long way down on the list of places that were likely to be open, and restaurants must be similar as well. I think some people will have started cooking from home. Some of those experiments will have worked, and some will not. And some people will be very grateful to be able to go back out. But it's missing the social element as much as eating out, etc. I think people are missing that more than the eating out experience. Chris?
I think we're starting to see some of those changes now, aren't we, Andy? And that things like organic food seems to be increasing as a proportion of sales, as people are perhaps a bit more concerned about provenance. And people talk about a new normality when this is over, and it will be over. Things won't be the same again. And I think we'll see a lot more food deliveries. The food delivery platforms have been very successful in the last couple of years, but that again has been accelerated by this situation. And I believe that that will remain. I think we'll move more to deliveries than perhaps going to shops physically.
I think, just dealing with the restaurant question first, that there's some quite interesting. I watched a webinar earlier this week where people from China were talking about some of the changes and behaviours in the food there. So, I'm sure you better find it. I can't just remember which one it was. You might appreciate I've been doing a lot of research at the moment, but there is stuff coming out of China about how they're returning to work, and how people are returning to restaurants and some of the things that happen. So I think there's a good indication of what might happen is there. In terms of rural communities, and I have experience of working with smallholders in Kenya, and one of the things that we will keep stressing is basic hygiene procedures, if implemented correctly, will protect us and our consumers for all of these products. And there's another question which is talking about, should people be eating sort of unwrapped fruit and vegetables? Well, the advice is always to wash fruit and vegetables. And again, if you wash fruit and vegetables in clean running water, you will deal with the viral risk. So wash them in clean running water, wash your hands afterwards. Basic food hygiene procedures will protect us when followed throughout the supply chain.
So on the point you've mentioned washing fruit and veg there, which is good, because a lot of people are talking about it, and it's good, talking about buying food loose these days. So there's another question about cleaning food packaging. So domestically, after it arrives in the home, some products are going to be antibacterial and some are antiviral. So is there any kind of a guidance and advice on that, please? Perhaps you, Sterling.
So for me, it's about, as Chris started off the session talking about, is what is the risk? And the risk is very low. And what people say, the trusted sources, is really aligned. So people are saying that it is highly unlikely that the virus will be transmitted either by food or be transmitted via the food packages. So please bear that in mind. Obviously, some people have still got concerns, and if you want to reduce the risk even further, you can wash it. As Chris said, it's normal hygiene practice. Perhaps we're not used to washing tins of beans when we get them at home, but the risk is so small. There are other risks that are greater than that I would focus on, that people can just wash them, just using water, and leave them to air dry. And if you really want to use the biocides, then as you say, if you look at the manufacturer's instructions, they're really clear about what they're effective against. And I think we should remember this isn't a super virus physically, and it's very difficult to destroy. We talked about the mechanisms you can do that. So it is easy to get rid of if we use the current practices that we have. And don't forget also about washing your hands. So if you're coming into the house from the shops, the first thing you should do is wash your hands as you come indoors. When you're unpacking and you finish doing that, you should wash your hands again. And for me, hand washing is the big way of controlling this problem. And to remember, it's not about washing your hands frequently, it's at washing them at the right times. That's what people have to remember. If you're going into a shop to buy stuff, if you're bringing something back into your home. So appropriate hand washing, I think, is also shouldn't be underrated.
Okay, so just information and reminder, some people might not know that IFST have a food safety management systems working group, and they're exploring new paradigms for assessing and verifying food safety capability this autumn to develop models fit for the future and suggesting how to best leverage new technologies. So if anybody has any ideas and they'd like to get in touch with challenges or questions for that group, then please send those across to IFST as well. So we're going to be drawing to a close quite soon, so I'll just touch on any final questions, or if the panel themselves have identified any on the Q&A, then please don't hesitate to raise those. So my next question will be about training, and there's quite a few questions about, will the current methods of food safety training change as a result of this epidemic? And other questions related to that, whether it's training live versus classroom and how adaptable we're having to be right now.
I think there's been a bit of an explosion in terms of online training, whether it be one-to-one. In fact, most of it's one-to-one. I know several people involved in the training sector who were rushed off their feet delivering training by this means. And we were on a call with a person from a supermarket chain who said, obviously their staff are working, but working from home, they're using the opportunity to get them their CPD up to date and their training brought up to date as well. So yeah, training definitely an opportunity for the media, whether it be these trainers have shares in Zoom, they'll be doing very well. Anybody else?
I think, Natasha, to get your point, is that there's an interesting question about fitness for work, which is, traditionally we've talked about 48 hours for somebody to be simplest after food poisoning. It is a question we've asked the FSA, and they're asking the PHE, which is, what is when somebody is no longer has symptoms, how long before they are no longer shedding virus? At the moment, the best we can say is stick to your 48 hours, and as soon as we get clarity from the FSA and PHE and others, we will pass that on. But it is it's a very good question, and one I wish I had a better answer for right at this moment.
Well, the situation's ongoing, and we're doing our best with your group, Chris, to address all these points. So that's really worth mentioning.
There's also a question here about cold and low temperature foods. During the COVID-19 pandemic, sorry, I'm getting repetitive. It is about your normal food hygiene procedures. I don't think you should avoid consumption of cold and low temperature foods. I presume what's behind the question is a view that actually the virus may remain active for longer, but actually in many cold and freezing situations, there's a high degree of dehydration too. So you've not only got chill, you've got dehydration, so it depends on the matrix. So I don't think anybody should be provided with any particular. Let's just go back to the basics, which is the expert's view is that the risk of getting this disease from food is very low. And therefore, providing you stick to good hygiene procedures, the risk can be made even lower. So I don't think we should be avoiding anything in particular at this time.
Just generally keeping healthy and keeping positive. So thank you, all three of you, for an excellent follow-up webinar, and once again answering the questions so well. Thank you to everyone for attending today. If we didn't manage to answer your questions, we'll try to do so afterwards via the IFST's COVID-19 advisory group, which you can send emails to info@ifst.org. And we may indeed arrange another webinar if we need to. We'll aim to share a recording of this session today, including the Q&A session, to everyone who attended via email, and it will be posted on our website within 5 working days. With that, I will draw this webinar to a close.